Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to the meeting of this Schools Forum. My name is Andrew Neal and I'm the current chair of Schools Forum. This event has been held in Kensington Town Hall and also being streamed live on YouTube. Members of the public and the media are welcome to watch the meeting remotely and listen to the discussions taking place. And I'm pleased to say that we are back in what feels like the home of Schools Forum, the room that it always used to be held in. So it is great to be back. Just to let you know that we just sent around, yes, now sending around declarations of interest form. If you could please fill that out. And given that we are broadcasting live, I'm going to ask people to go around and introduce themselves. Well, members only to introduce themselves.
Alison Mould, Vice Chair, and Chair of Houghton Primary.
I'm Jack Deep-Birdie, I'm the Executive Head at Marlborough and Colville Primary Schools.
Stephen Keogh, Professor Carnival, Student CFO, St Joseph's.
Amanda Sayers, Chairman of Saints Catholic College.
Kathleen Williams, Executive Head at Servite and St Francis Assisi.
Peter Bassett, Governor at Avondale and Strand Primary School Federation.
David Sellens, the Head Teacher at Thomas Jones.
Sarah Gawette, Executive Head Teacher at St Thomas's and also St Clement and St James Primary Schools.
Mariella Arjon, Principal at Chelsea Academy.
Claire for representing PVI, Capital's Nursery School.
I'm Michelle McWalter. I'm the Business Manager at Chelsea Open Nursery School, representing the maintained nursery schools.
I'm Lawrence Weeks, I'm the Finance Director at Kensington Aldridge Academy. I'm substituting for David Benson, our Principal.
Okay, and then our councillors at the back.
Councillor Emmettier.
Councillor Evans from Cornfield Board and Chair of Family Services Select.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everybody, and we obviously also have officers today as well. Okay, we'll move on to item A2, apologies for absence, and we have apologies from Councillor Atkinson, David Benson, Roisin Butt, and also Craig Hamlin Smith as well. Okay, A3, declarations of interest. Do any members have any declarations to make specific to items on the agenda separate to the forwards going around? No, okay, fantastic. Item A4, minutes of the meeting held on 17th of January. Are there any comments on the minutes or anything that Peter?
On A3, I'd like to be described as a Governor of Avondale and St Anne's School Federation, rather than affiliated with. Please. Thank you.
Anything else?
On A5, in relation to the second paragraph there, members question about total funding for travelling children. Officers agreed to discuss details such as this outside the meeting. I think it's slightly more specific than that. About whether it could be reviewed in the coming year.
Okay, we can do all the wording change that officers agreed to discuss and review.
Be nice, yes, thank you.
Yep.
Apologies, Chris. That sat my head. I do apologise. I think I'd understood that David Benson did contact me with just a discussion, but I mean, at least I'll be happy to be part of that.
He did, and we had a good email sort of communication within which we said that we'd meet. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Okay, right, so in terms of the minutes, is it your wish for them to be signed off as a correct record?
Yes.
Right, thank you. Let's move on to item A5. This is the High News Review and Forecast update for 2021-22. It's going to be presented primarily by Julie, Anita as well, and there's a lot of detail and a lot to consider in this one. So, Julie, I'll hand over to you to explain the detail on that.
Thank you, Chair.
Forum members will remember at the meeting in January, when we highlighted the forecast overspend in the high needs block and drew attention to the significant increase in funding that had been allocated through the new education banding tool, the EBT. And members will recall that we introduced the banding tool because we recognised that the previous system, which was based on historic hourly rates, was no longer fit for purpose, and we wanted to bring in a system that would ensure that funding was targeted to children with the most complex needs, that it was transparent and it was consistent, therefore equitable in terms of the amount of resource that went to individual schools and individual children. So as a result of the focus on this at the January forum, it was agreed to carry out an urgent and detailed review of how the EBT was working. So on the 1st of February, the High Needs Budget Review Group met to consider whether we could continue to roll out the EBT, whether it was affordable. We had agreed a 3-year phased rollout. What the review group noted from the findings was that although it had enabled some improvements, there were top-ups of over £17,500 a year, and they, when compared to the full-time cost of a teaching assistant, they were much higher, and therefore an unsustainable rate for such a large percentage of pupils moving forward. And obviously we weren't suggesting that the most effective practice was to have a full-time teaching assistant. So the review found that 60% of the funding that was going out through the EBT was actually going at band 7 and above, which exceeds 5 hours one-to-one teaching assistant equivalent funding per day, and 38% of the funding was actually above the full-time cost of a teaching assistant. And when we did the modelling on the tool before we rolled it out, obviously we had a normal distribution curve, so this looked very different to what we'd anticipated we would find. We'd always expected that it would cost more money because we knew that the historic rates were out of date, but it was such a significant amount more than we'd estimated. So in the review, we highlighted some concerns with weaknesses in the tool in the way that it was working, particularly where children had social, emotional, mental health needs or sensory seeking behaviours. The tool was adding on extra points and bumping the bands up, and we could see that it needed some adjustment, and we met with the developers Imosphere, who did their own modelling and testing and agreed that this was happening and that the tool itself needed recalibration, and they agreed to do that and improve the calculations. We also found in our review that there was some blurring between what was needs and what was provision, and we were able to share that back with the developers. We also recognised that there were some differences in the way that ages and phases, stages of development were treated by the tool. So just to give you an example, if you're 3 and you can't do your buttons up on your coat, that doesn't have the same implications for your life as if you're 13 and you can't do your buttons up on your coat. And the system developers could see when we presented them with our findings that the recalibration was needed to address those issues. So they are making those changes and improving the quality of guidance to the assessors who use the tool, and those changes will all be live for the start of the financial year. But the position that we're in at the moment is obviously we have a deficit recovery plan, and we have an in-year deficit, and we have evidence from the review that some of the bandings were allocated erroneously. So we need to address and correct what has happened. So in the report, we're suggesting a number of proposals to tackle the errors and put the corrections in place going forward. So if I take you to paragraph 5, one of the things that we're suggesting is that from April, a cap is put on the amount of funding at bands 8 to 10. So we recognise what the full-time cost of the teaching assistant is, and we say that that's a cap on those higher bands, unless the EHCP for the child actually specifies such a high level of resource is needed for the provision for that child, in which case the cap is lifted and the funding banding returns to what it would have been. And in the appendices, we put in a table at Appendix A, and if I take you to Appendix A, it's the third column of figure, so with the indulgence of the chair, if we use your school as an example, because it is the top row. If you read across the All Saints Catholic College row, you'll see in the third column it says 26,243. That would be the impact of putting that cap in for everybody at band 8 to 10 from April. That would be the effect of how much lower the level of funding that would go out to those bands would be. So we are suggesting that there would be a moderation process to ensure that if the child's plan says that they do need that very intense level of funding, and there will be some examples of children with very exceptional levels of needs and very high provision specified in Part F of their plans, that the safety net will mean that that cap isn't there, that goes back. But taking you back to paragraph 5.1, what we're saying is that the estimated reduction in funding to get us back on track for making that change would be £412,000 reduction. We're not proposing, in paragraph 5.2 of the report, to make changes to the bands from the summer term. So taking you back to, when we introduced the EBT, we attached a cash value to each band based on what we thought we were funding in terms of hours from the old historic rate, and prorating that up to take account of pay and price changes. We're not saying, actually, let's cut those bands. There's no proposal to make any cuts, so just be really clear there. We are suggesting that as each child's EHC plan is reviewed during the next year, that we take that opportunity to confirm the band is correct or to correct it, and that we use the annual review cycle to be able to do that, and that where changes are needed to make a correction, that they happen from the 1st of September 22. That we're not suggesting that they happen back in this year when the erroneous payment has happened, but that we give everybody notice that we're going to make the correction from the 1st of September across the board, the same date for everybody. If I take you back to Appendix A, and then using the All Saints example again, the first column is £10,735, and the second column is 6768. This is a very broad brush of if every annual review at All Saints for children who are banded up to band 6 reduced by £2,000, that would be the cash change that they would see. And if every band 7 upwards reduced by 50%, that would be the cash change. But it wouldn't actually be those amounts, Anita, would it? Because they are the full year value, and as we are proposing doing it from September, you'll realise it would only actually be 7/12 of those amounts, not that full amount. So these appendices were broad brush estimates of what the full year reduction would be if we were to take these reductions at the start of April, but we're proposing that they happen from September to make sure everybody's got a lead-in time. Is it worth pausing there and taking any questions before we talk about the hospital education?
I think this is a sort of separate issue. I suppose, I think the key thing that is further on in the paper, lest we forget, is that we're very close to a £9 million deficit from the high limit lot. And very
Thank you,
quickly.
James. Sarah, A1.
Making
Yeah.
very dense into that deficit. And actually, this will make a difference.
Can I, sorry, Chair, can I just ask on one clarification? On 5.1, you'll be saying that the gross cost of a full-time teaching assistant is 23,502, i.e. 17,502
Plus the 6,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And does that include employers?
On costs. Yeah.
On costs.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just ask what point that is on the scale?
Midpoint.
Midpoint, which point, which scale?
So we based it on the information that we had from school returns in terms of what was being paid for teaching assistants. But we can confirm afterwards exactly what that average point was. But we have based it on what we see from return schools are paying out.
And is the median point on the scale the average that really is being paid by schools?
According to the returns that we've got from schools, yes.
And have you taken account of the 1.75% increase that's just been backdated? And national insurance changes and all the other changes to salaries that are happening right now. That's 3% difference already. Yeah. And that's not included this year's salary review. All told, 10%.
I'd be surprised if it added 10.
Yeah, that gets
It will be. It will be. If you actually look at median figures and look at real figures that we're really paying people,
Yes.
it will be 10%.
It is.
Yeah, it is, it's huge.
But you're absolutely.
And further to that, could you do some work on looking at how this is going to affect our out-of-borough charging as well, and ask schools what the out-of-borough charging impact will be? Because we set our ILA agreements with out-of-borough children based on how much we charge you, and that's going to have an impact on our other children that we have in as well. And so further 12 in one school, so the overall impact in terms of funding is much greater than we've got there, and it's much greater than we're getting in increases to pay for everything this year. Essentially, in one fell swoop, we're going to get a budget cut large enough to put us in a really difficult position.
So I'm
I'm going to ask you to think again. Absolutely.
Can I add to that a little bit? I just did, when I read this earlier, I did a bit of maths on the staff at my school. We've got 14 education healthcare plans at St Thomas's. So first of all, I don't think we probably have enough the first 6,000 to cover that, first of all. Then I looked at the cost it's going to be next year, and on average, the cost of a teaching assistant is 22,500. So obviously with all these increases and so on and so forth. So that worried me. And then I started looking at the figures for St Thomas's, and I can see that, you know, we're going to lose quite a lot of money. I'm glad it's only 7/12, but then that will go forward into years going forward. We're struggling as it is. We were already making up £35,000 on our TA costs anyway. So now I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to be having to make up another, in a normal year, another £33,000 on top of that, if the figures go through as they are. And the other thing that concerned me was that I did, because I feel like, oh dear, maybe I didn't get a chance to input and offer, and then now it's come to this. And I did ask if I could come to the last Chinese block meeting, but for some reason I didn't get invited, and I know the same as some of my colleagues. And I feel like we really need to, as Jagdeep says, I feel like we really need to go at this again and look at this again before a decision is made, and that we need to take a broader view from many more heads, because these are big pieces of money in what is a very tight situation. I've worked over the last 3 weeks to balance my budget. Having nearly got there, I then read this and I despaired. So there are a few things there that I'd like you to consider.
A couple of points. The first one is to reassure you that the 50-50 arrangement that we have is going to continue. So when 50% of your notional funding is used to meet the first 6,000 and we refund 50%, don't we, for those of the
I don't know
6,000?
if that's
I think that's
Yes,
okay.
it is,
Yeah.
yeah,
It happens automatically.
yeah.
And
When
where
you-
does it come into the budget? So where is it?
It's very hard to see
Because
it.
if it's through
Yeah.
your poo, it
No, we do it as a separate payment.
And what does it?
targeted-
How is it categorised?
Targeted support. We definitely
Because I've
make
struggled
payments.
I think some of the work needs to be done there as well to make that more clear.
Yeah.
because
But,
that's
but
not
it's
evident.
continuing, so we're not proposing taking that away, so that will still be
Brilliant.
there. So if you've got a high number of EHCPs, you're likely to reach
Yeah.
your
So we-
50,000.
Yeah.
Is that RBKC basically, so is it fees in total?
That's it,
All of
in
them.
total,
All of
and
them.
we're estimating that we're going to pay out 207,000 in total, so we're definitely doing.
Because we have as many, if not more, out of our
Yeah, no,
HCPs
it is everybody, it is everybody. And then the next thing I wanted to say, if I could just take you back to para 4.1 of the report. In order to understand whether the EBT was providing adequate top-up, we developed our own provision costing tool, and we looked at the description of the provision that's in the plan in section F, so what must be provided, and we costed it using typical staffing rates for different types of staff, so teachers and teaching assistants. And in the sample that we looked at, we found on average the band was providing £3,500 more than the cost of the provision that was specified in the plan, which might be the kind of buffer that would be needed to anticipate additional inflationary increases.
I think that I understand that, and actually schools will need time to adjust that if that is the case. If we've employed people based on the amount of money that we're getting for a child, then that person is employed. They need to be paid, and actually we've got to carry on paying them. So we will need time to adjust that. And we in schools that I'm working with, and it's hard not to speak from a personal point of view, you know, I try not to do that too much, but actually that I'm talking about 34 employees.
So in terms of the other points that you raised, Jagdeep, about the 1.75% pay award and the national insurance increase, I'm happy to go back and check that when we calculated the 23502, whether we need to adjust that to take account of those, because if that isn't in there, then clearly, you know, we do need to take account of that.
Thank you.
Sorry, there was a question about the out of borough as well. I still think that's. I don't think you necessarily. I think you, depending on, as you said, you follow what's effectively what's charged the authority. I think you can continue to do that. If you want to continue with the charges as they are now, you've still got a basis for that. But you know, you might want to, and that's what you're paying out in your costs. But you might want to, you know, because they're not. You can have a different
differentiated
bands,
rate.
there's not bands for the out of borough. So
I've got one more technical question actually.
So because the point is that out of boroughs, and we have lots of us that central into our schools, they actually do work from your funding, so they're using that historic funding level of £15.42 per hour, and they will look at your banding. So this will have a much wider impact. For most of our schools, we'll have maybe a third RBKC EHCP, so at least double out of borough as well.
You are allowed within the finance regs to have a differentiated rate. Certainly for the special schools, they're allowed to charge out borough residents. Yeah, we can do that because we are now being charged by Hammersmith and Fulham top-ups plus therapy for all of our children that go across the boundaries. So there's lots of differentiation happening, and I think we can support the pushback on that.
Yeah, David, do you still have? Yes.
I just want to ask a question on early years as well. If we had an early years educator with a pupil, would that be a justification for raising that cap? Because if we're basing on actual costs, the actual cost of an early years educator with level 3 qualification is much, much higher than that. And the local authority pays much, much higher in its specialist, in its like quite much in the gardens and places like that than that right now. So if we're going to be doing, you know, putting the right kind of adult with an early years child with a qualification, their starting salaries are about 26,000.
We're suggesting that the safety net for not having the cap would be what's specified in the child's plan. So if the plan specifies that they have to have a particular type of skilled adult working with them, then we will be able to do the provision costing tool and show that this is something that costs more money. I can imagine that there are sensory impaired children who need a qualified intervener, somebody with an additional skill, and their hourly rate will be more, but their plans will specify it, so there'll be no debate about it, that will be transparent.
So the high needs review group, in terms of what the terms of reference were and the membership, was agreed at the forum.
Yeah.
It came to consultative, and we were asked to ask for people who are eager to attend. I was eager, but I was told that I would be certainly to find themselves.
I don't think that reached us, that there was an offer to have additional people available, because we've been keen to make sure that we're getting the number of people there that we need to have a sensible discussion, and certainly we've produced a very detailed paper to be able to sort of show the granular level of the findings that we had from the review.
That, I know we have struggled with attendance at the High-Needs Review Group over the years, and it's absolutely the intention that we get as many contributions as we can. Obviously, I know Paul, who is the chair, isn't here this evening, but I think we want to get, it's an open forum essentially. Obviously, we're doing it in person.
The date and the time wasn't supplied, so it's very difficult to attend a meeting when you don't know the date or the time. And it was raised at executive as well.
It was.
Well, we can take that back to the chair of the group, to Paul.
Yeah, I mean, that group technically reports into the forum, doesn't it?
Yes,
So
yes.
I think we just need to review that and ensure that it's an open group, is it?
Well,
Or is it
Forum
membership?
had agreed a representation, a formulaic representation. So, and Paul had kindly offered to chair the group when we met. So the dates are set with Paul.
So it probably just let's circulate that across the.
Paul doesn't seem to know the date or the time when
we
he
did ask
was asked as well. So
Okay, I think we need to get into that. I think everyone agrees with you, David, on the ideological principles around, these are our most vulnerable children that we're trying to provide for. I suppose that the pressures that local authority officers are facing is coming from DFE to sort this out. How are you going to sort it out?
can I ask why there's still a reluctance not to go back and push back to the DFE as other boroughs have done? I understand the debt isn't at the to the extent of other boroughs, but I think when we're looking at our most vulnerable children, this is when we should be standing up and protecting that funding and pushing back to the DFE. And therefore, I'm at loss to know why this borough is reluctant to do so.
From my understanding, I don't think they are. They're trying to find something that the DFE are like tough. That's the understanding that I've got.
Yes, I think there's a couple of things there. I mean, we all continue to lobby and welcome support for and lobbying for more high needs funding, because above and beyond where we are with the education banding, which is a specific issue, and I know colleagues have spent a lot of time looking into it to put the paper to you with some options. We can't get away from the fact that demand for education, health and care needs assessments is rising. It's got about 8% a year. I think, Julie, that's a national and a local issue, and also the complexity of needs increasing. Do we think it's enough money in the high needs one we get each year from government? No, we don't. I think people are saying that across the country. We are getting an above inflation increase, but we still say it's not enough. So we're all lobbying for more high needs. I can assure you.
What happens if the debt just increases?
Well,
and what because I think the pressure's been pushed back into mainstream schools that are really stretched, and we're starting to see even there was a case last week of a teaching assistant being assaulted by a child. We've all had situations like that in our schools that are really serious because of underfunding. So it's rather than pushing the pressure back into mainstream schools, what would happen if we just allowed the debt to grow?
Well, two things. A, we're getting a lot of challenge from the DFE about the size of our current deficit. We're monitoring quite closely on the in-year plan. I think I understand from Anita that the DFE are going to send a couple of members of staff in to analyse our progress against the plan. With regard to local authorities with larger high needs deficits and that kind of safety valve approach, which we're aware of, over the border, we've been told our deficit isn't big enough yet to warrant a safety valve approach. I mean, Kathy, with your other house on, with that agreement to repay parts of the deficit, there's a really tight in-year plan. I think we'd be under even more pressure than we are now. Ultimately, this is a local authority grant. I've sat in this room with the member of the council talking about the high needs deficits and where we stand currently with it. What I would say is if these changes, these recommendations don't go forward tonight, we're going to have to look at ways in which we find other efficiencies in the high needs block. We're about to come onto a paper to look at some of our spend around alternative provision, for instance, some of the non-statutory elements. Already we're proposing a reduction in what we spend there. That's not easy either. Potentially the DFE would push us to make bigger reductions there. So if we don't make some of these changes, and I appreciate the point about the membership of the group of consultation, we're probably going to have to start looking at other areas. And if we don't decide to do that proactively, the DFE will require us to do that.
I mean, that's very clear, Neil, and I'm not going to go over other people have said in relation to the financial imperative, but what I don't see in this paper is an impact assessment on the actual students and children, because we may decide to accept this, we may go down this road, at the very least what we should have is exactly what the impact is going to be on candidates of students.
So can I respond to that to say there shouldn't be an impact because we are funding the provision. The amount of funding that is coming out is a match to what is specified in the child's plan.
Just to finish, I mean, I can't make that judgment because I'm not a professional. I have an idea, but it's not rooted in. But I mean, was there an impact assessment, informally or formally done within the high needs group as part of this exercise, just so that we know what we're voting?
So the level of detail that we did, we took individual samples and we analysed the provision that the child required. So just taking so we looked at a child in the early years whose plan says that they require a speech and language programme, they need time in a low arousal space, they need school-based OT programme. We then costed up every element of their provision that they should have and then compared that to the amount of funding that's coming out in the banding. We did samples for early years, primary and secondary, and on average the banding was delivering £3,500 per year more than the cost of the provision.
I understood that, but that's not what I'm hearing in relation to.
I think that's different to what you described.
My point is that clearly we're going to have to make some difficult decisions, but at the very least there needs to be some record of us recognising and taking responsibility for any negative impact that's going to have on data quality.
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of things that really hit the nail on the head, really, and that is that, firstly, the DFE's view on this is that we're not funded, that we're overfunded the high bands. That's what they're going to say. But as Jagdeep said, nevertheless, this has been going to schools' coffers, and we've got staff on the books that we're paying. And therein lies the real issue that those who are certainly heads of governors around the table facing is what next? What's the sort of decisions that we're going to have to make about staff? And that's the really, really difficult thing. There isn't, as Ian's saying, just an endless possibilities like this. And it could end up being an instruction from the DFE, or we look at the non-statutory areas and we just start removing the funding. That's the difficult decision that we've got to make. Anita.
Sorry, it's going back a little bit. Just the points that Kathleen was making about us lobbying the DfE. I've been at, when we had our last meeting about our deficit recovery plan for DfE, Sarah really pushed for them to give us safety valve funding. Why? Just because we've taken action here, why do we not receive funding that other boroughs have received? And ultimately, they as Ian said, they said our deficit is not big enough. We are, however, other than those that have got the safety valve funding, we're in the next 55 local authorities nationally that have the highest proportion of DSG deficit. So we've just had a meeting, we're now part of a group where the DfE will be sending in a high needs specialist and a high needs finance specialist, and we will be able to put together a more detailed action plan and bids for some money that might help us in terms of delivering a balanced high needs block deficit recovery. They're not going to fund, they've made it very clear they're not going to fund the deficit, but they might help, they might give us some provision to do, say, some more work on the review on the independent placements or on the post-16. So we will be bidding for those sorts of funding, but very clear that we won't get funding to fund that.
And the timeline for that is imminent. We had the first meeting with the DfE and they said, right, you're in the 55, we're sending in our specialists that we've recruited to work with all 55 authorities that we've identified, and you will be expected to put an action plan together. We said we've already got a deficit recovery plan. They said no, this is something much more specific that we're going to want to see so that we know that you're tackling this.
And in terms of the in terms of the private placements, I mean that still seems quite high. Isn't that something we should be targeting rather than always mainstream children in schools?
We certainly are looking at it. We've got another high needs block reference group that's running with FE colleges and St Charles Sixth Form are on that with us, looking at how we meet some of those children's needs in a local FE setting rather than the high cost specialist independent where they charge whatever fees they want. We think that this work with the DfE as part of the 55 might give us an opportunity to explore what it is that the FE colleges can't deliver that means that we are driven down the independent, non-maintained sector route. And we think some of that's around therapies, access to occupational therapy, speech and language therapy integrated as part of the sort of overall package. So, they're indicating there will be a bit of resource for us to be able to do that. If we can create capacity in our post-16 providers through training the workforce and making sure they've got the right environments to deliver some of this provision, it will certainly mean cost avoidance in the future so that we don't have to use those placements going forward.
Any other views on this? Do you want to move on to the next part of the paper?
Okay, so thank you. The next part of the paper is about hospital education, and just a refresh for everybody that as a result of COVID, Chelsea Community Hospital Schools had to move out of the hospital and has relocated to Bayswater Children's Centre. We are working with the DfE to look at the additional costs that have had to be borne as a result of having to completely relocate from the hospital. The DfE have asked us for quite a lot, is what I wanted to say. They've demanded quite a lot of information from us, including proof that we had to leave the hospital because of COVID. So they're being quite challenging around the resource level there. We're developing a service level agreement between the authority as the commissioner and the hospital school as the provider with an aim of clarifying and making transparent the amount of resource that goes to the hospital school. And we have brought in a specialist from the DfE to do some benchmarking around what does it cost to deliver a hospital school. It's very difficult to get cost comparison and to be able to kind of prove that it's value for money, and that work is just coming to a conclusion. The nub of this is the hospital school are asking for a greater level of funding. We said, we really need to know that what we've got is best value and the most economic way of delivering that. And we'll be bringing that back to the forum once we've got the outcome from the DFE at the funding request.
Right, okay, so is that the end of paper presentation?
I think we've covered everything in terms of
The forecast out to,
deficit,
yeah.
forecast, yeah.
Okay, this is an extremely difficult one for obvious reasons. I think you've outlined why it's extremely difficult, and it's difficult on both sides. So, if we look at the what we're asking to note and agree on, so schools formula has to 9.11 note the review and the recalibration of the EBT in section 4. And then the next part is about approving. So the request is to approve the EBT proposals in section 5. Now I wonder if this might need to go to a vote. However, can I suggest that if we do approve the EBT proposals in section 5, that we factor into that approval the increase in the salary cost that we saw in the last year and proposed increases in national insurance and future salary increases that
The
might...
capped amount is revised to take account of
Yeah, if
Kathie's
it's not in
comments.
there, yeah, I agree to that.
So that that might have a bit more of an impact and say in some I think some of the certain primary schools. So, okay. So what I think we'll do is you might need to you ready.
That's the beginning.
I wonder if there's another proposal which is just that we could have a chance to actually just go through this, have another high needs block meeting and actually just understand it a bit more. I know that's putting it off, but it's just a thought.
Okay.
I would agree with that.
I'd be much happy with that.
What's the date?
15th of June.
What's the impact of doing that? Julie, Ian?
I think one of the biggest
I know you're meeting the DFE imminently.
tomorrow.
Okay.
One of the challenges that we will have is if we then proceed to make those changes, at that point we'll be making them retrospectively. Because in order to achieve the 411 that we think that we would make from capping bands 8, 9 and 10, we'd then be in June, July trying to retrospectively introduce a cap, and we'd be saying the effective date for correcting any overbandings that had happened is we're at the end of term and now we're going to do it right at the start of term. So people would have less notice for the implementation date.
I get that. I was just going to say, could we have another meeting sooner so that we can...
A forum meeting?
Or another high needs block meeting sooner so that we can sort of, because I agree it's too long to wait, isn't it? We have something in April.
One of the things we could do is there was a very detailed review paper. So, you know, we could send the paper out to everybody tomorrow so that people have got the level of detail that shows all of the calculations.
There is some additional detail that we probably need to look at for what was raised around salary increases. And I think that will have an impact. But that could presumably be done in spreadsheets, adjusted, amended, so that we can see that very easily. An additional column showing the 7/12ths.
Can we vote via email if we've actually got to get the new figures? We are to do that. It's not public.
Yeah, I think that's quite
I mean,
problematic, isn't it?
we could have an extraordinary schools forum.
a one item agenda.
Yeah.
Extraordinary meeting.
And we could do that online.
So obviously we want to try and achieve this if we can by the end of the month, mindful of the DFE meeting tomorrow. You know, listen, I appreciate people's points about the high needs review group and when the meeting is, who's invited, and you know, if we want people to take part in it, clearly people feel that have that opportunity. We could potentially arrange, by agreement with Paul as chair of the group, you know, further high needs review group meeting next week and make that more an open meeting and discussion, and potentially then perhaps organise a single item Teams meeting of schools forum next week on this item. The other scenario is to say, subject to, if you like, the agreements and approval of next week's findings review group, that forum approves it tonight. It feels like people want to hear the feedback from the review group and potentially bring a Teams meeting or forum together next week.
I agree with all of that because, again, repeating myself, what is missing for me is what the real impact is going to be at the receiving end. And I get the impression from my professional colleagues here that that's the missing bit, the jigsaw. Now, it may be in that when I read it, but I just think that needs to be very transparent. If you're making that decision, these are going to be the consequences. Or the fact that you've been receiving money over the odds. I mean, it doesn't look like it from the faces of my colleagues, but because it doesn't add up the fact that you can recoup nearly £500,000 and not have any impact on the quality of care. But it might do, and from my point of view.
I'm not sure, given the timescales, how we pull together a piece of work that scale. Because that's
It's already there. It's just not in.
I think it's so complicated when you look at the structures of schools and how money is spent in schools on the time too.
The reality is we provide more than we're given. Yeah, we always do.
Yeah.
Always,
Impact is a
we always
diluted
do
effect
provide more,
of
and we
financial
will
support
continue
for
to
the
do
student.
that in one way or another. Yeah. So actually, the impact won't be on children. The impact will be on
Absolutely.
and we will find a way because we always do.
I mean, this always been the problem, isn't it? It's not physics, and that's, you know, two add two doesn't add up to 5. The problem's always been that if a child's allocated 20 hours, very quickly we ascertained that actually that child should have been awarded far more, and we compensate and we ensure that what we do is deliver so that child by the end of year 6 is shining brightly, goes into a mainstream secondary school and continues to be resourceful, robust, highly articulate, actually bucks the trend and defies all expectation. That's it, isn't it? Really?
I think the issue is now that when you get schools that are really on the breadline in terms of, you know, or a school in deficit, which is one of mine is, then you can't afford to do that anymore. And then it does impact children because you have no options. So £30,000 out of a very, very tight budget is going to have an impact on children because you've got to dilute that offer. There's no doubt about it, and there's no getting away from it. You can't find £30,000 when you haven't got that £30,000. That's another member of staff, and it's a child sharing a resource that they used to have bespoke to them. So that is the issue. I think in other years there was more money in schools, and so I advocate for the schools that it will actually dilute the offer for children. There's no way of getting around that. As much as we'd love to do it differently, we can't.
I don't think anyone here is going to disagree with that. But fine, God's
Yeah,
sake.
but is there another way? I mean, are we looking at the non-statutory? What is that one? What does that look like? All of the the specialist and private placements that we're paying for. Is there a way of looking at that? Does it have to come from the most stretched services that I think are mainstream schools supporting very, very high needs and complex needs?
I think one of the pressures with the reason that children are in the independent non-maintained sector is that when their plans are drafted and you're consulting with the local maintained provider, whether it's early years, primary, secondary or post-16, you're only going to the independent non-maintained sector when the responses you receive to the consultation are, we're not able to meet these needs in our setting. So unfortunately, until we create capacity in the maintained sector to meet the needs, and often it is around their therapeutic needs, so the occupational therapy, the speech and language therapy, you end up going to the independent sector because you haven't got an offer in the maintained sector. And in order to not have children in the independent non-maintained, we have to have schools prepared to include those very complex children. It's chicken and egg then, isn't it? Because you haven't got the resource to do it. The new school is absolutely bursting at the seams. We pushed them to take an extra class, and they went out to try and recruit staff to be able to do that. We've agreed funding for another 3 students over the place funding that we'd anticipated we would have in this year to keep children in the new special school and not send them to the independent sector. So we are absolutely doing that first.
I think that the pressure would be even higher if it
Yeah,
were
absolutely.
increasable, and it is making a
Yeah,
difference.
50
but it's
places
just
more.
stopping the deficit getting even higher,
Yeah.
rather than, eliminating it, clearly.
Okay, I think we're going to need to move on from this. So I think that the only way we can move on is, I think, if we recalculate what we've just discussed, how quick can we get that done, Anita?
Certainly, early next week at the latest.
Now, I just wonder, do we need the high needs block reference group, or do we just bring this straight back to the forum for one item meeting next week?
I get the impression they'd like to talk about this.
Pardon?
I get the impression that the high needs meeting might be.
But
might be appreciated.
they report into here.
I think there needs to be a way of having a discussion about it as well. But I don't, whether that's through high needs block or whether we can have another discussion once we understand the figures again.
Yeah, I think it certainly wouldn't just be a meeting to vote. It would
Yeah.
we need a discussion. But I wonder if trying to coordinate a high needs block meeting group and then another forum might be just a bridge too far, given that we've gone into the detail of this discussion, and it could just introduce too many more variables into it.
I'm going to suggest that we next week, if you get the figures, yeah, that allows us during next week we have a consultative, perhaps, yeah, and that gives us as heads time to look at it, and then after Easter we have a forum, straight after Easter in that first week. I know that means it will be agreed in time for your DFE discussion, but I think what we're saying, when you go into your DFE discussion, you are saying that you are on the precipice of an agreement, but it's not quite agreed yet. Yeah? Because actually we just need to agree some detail, don't we, before we get to an agreement.
Could the DFE meeting be postponed?
No, it's not just with us.
Okay, would that work? I mean, obviously it works for schools with budgets because we won't set and signed off budgets, because there's obviously a budget impact here for all of us. Can it work if we do it the first week back after Easter?
I think I have to say my preference would be people can. I think Julia needs to have done a really detailed paper, and again, not everybody saw it at the high needs review. If it wasn't fed back, we absolutely acknowledge and understand that. We can definitely circulate that paper to you. A lot of detail is in there. What will be new and different is the amendment to the capped amount which needs for the team. We can get that out to you as a pack. My preference would be that we do meet for the end of the financial year to have a 1 hour Teams meeting so we can be clear on this. I mean, we can say to the DFE, we are going to seek to reach agreement on this change, so it can be implemented from the start of the financial year. Otherwise, absolutely up for what you propose, Catherine, is having a broader discussion as a better attended and more widely promoted around finding a good meeting about some of the other areas of spend. And the DFE would want us to do that. That's good practice to look at every area of spend. But I think we've got a particularly urgent issue here that we do need to try and resolve by the end of the financial year.
Okay, well, I think we need to try and get it in next week then. Should we if we get the calculations done by
as soon as
Friday,
possible. Yeah.
and then we'll try and get a meeting in the middle of next week.
Yes, we've got Westminster Schools Forum on Monday, so it definitely wouldn't be Monday, but potentially it would be Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday, wouldn't it, for the end of March, to try and get maybe a 1 hour meeting in, and we do our very best to get the papers out to you by the end of this week, and if it weren't, then it would be first thing Monday morning, so it'd be either Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday. Probably rather than canvassing you all now, we would seek to do that with Emma offline, try and get a date that people can make.
Just confirm
suppose you'd be happy not to have a week's notice on dispatch. You happy with that?
Yeah, waive it, yeah.
Can I just check that it's going to be an online meeting, is that?
Is that preferred online given the circumstances?
Yeah.
You said 1 hour is. I think that's ambitious. Okay, so I think in terms of what we're agreeing, we're just going to pause on 911 and 912, aren't we? 913, Julie?
So,
Or are we just pausing on all of these until the extraordinary meeting next week?
Do you think, for clarity, Julian, it might be more helpful just to come back with some revised recommendations in a separate set of papers so the vote happens next week? Because we could maybe note and approve some of these but not others, and maybe it's best to do a full set.
yeah, so it would be cleaner, wouldn't it?
Would that be
Do it all in
Yeah.
one go.
more helpful?
Okay, right, well, big discussion, difficult discussion, but we'll come back to it next week. Right, paper A6, DSG, Lisa.
Thank you. So since the last DSG monitoring report in January, we've actually had a significant reduction to the early years DSG allocations, which is due to the child numbers being revised to be based on January 2020, whereas previously were based on 2019. Most of that reduction is not an issue, because if there's fewer children in early years provision, we pay out less, obviously. But I'll come on to where there is a bit of an impact on that. Now, in table 2, you've got all of the variances on 3 different blocks, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. And that's where we get to the total DSG for in-year forecast of 3,341,000 deficit or overspend. So looking at the early years overspend of 581,000, 496 is really just a timing issue, because it relates to a payments agreed at the end of 2021 that we weren't actually able to do the payments until 21-22. And was all funded from the early years block. Part of the reduction in funding was on the maintained nursery supplement, which we have, as well as other areas of, there's been lobbying on the early years funding, particularly in London, and within that lobbying letter to the DfE, it includes about maintained nursery supplement. Getting a reduction in funding in end of January of a financial year is very, very difficult to deal with, and that's why we would not want to pass that on in year to the maintained nurseries. So we're planning to fund that from the early years contingency, as well as the overspend on the early years SEF. But that does mean that we will need to look at the maintained nursery supplement funding for 22-23. Because if the funding we're getting in is lower, then unfortunately the funding we can pass on will be lower. Moving on to the schools block and the central block, the main overspend in there is to do with the schools reorganisation costs. And we took account of that when we did the delegation for school budgets in 22-23. Also a bit of an overspend on fair access payments. On high needs, I wasn't planning to, we've covered all that. So then just in summary, and the recommendation is just a note, and that once we take account of the in-year forecast overspend, as we've already said, that means that we think the year-end deficit, cumulative deficit, would be 8,731,000. And the in-year deficit the in-year overspend on high needs is about 1.4 million higher than we had in our deficit recovery plans. And that, as we all know, is the scale of the changes that have been happening.
Any questions from board members? Okay, thanks. Anita, I asked on to note the report as stated in 411. Okay, we move on to paper A7, and this is the alternative provision behaviour outreach proposals and Laura is going to come through this and you will join us.
No, carry on. The purpose of this paper is to outline the proposed level of investment from the high needs block for alternative provision and behaviour outreach provision. Just in terms of context, the local authority entered into a 12-month contract with Ormiston Academies Trust in September for the delivery of alternative provision and behaviour outreach. Those services were previously provided by TBAP. The services that form part of those contracts cover alternative provision, so for the provision for children and young people who are removed from mainstream education because of their behaviour, so typically a permanent exclusion, a managed move, or occasionally a fair access placement. And then our behaviour outreach services, which are split into the managed interventions, which is a form of short off-site placement for secondary age pupil, a risk of exclusion or on a fixed term exclusion for more than 5 days, and primary interventions which are carried out on site at nursery and primary schools for pupils at risk of exclusion. The services are primarily funded via the high needs block, with schools contributing to some non-statutory elements of the offer. Just looking in a little bit of detail on the alternative provision commissioning arrangements, the first 6 months of the contract with Ormiston have been positive, and we've seen some really good improvements in terms of the level of monitoring information that's shared with the local authority and positive steps towards partnership working in terms of the referrals into alternative provision. And the local authority intends to exercise the committed extension to the AP contract, which is for a further 3 years. The local authority recognises the value of the provision in terms of supporting local children and young people that have been excluded and removed from mainstream education. However, the pressures on the high needs block mean that the level of funding for non-statutory elements of the provision need to be reduced. And to do that, the strategy is to gradually reduce the level of investments into managed move placements, which are the non-statutory placements, with the expectation that if a school still needs to access those places, they would increasingly fund those directly. This is in line with practice in other boroughs where the high needs block only funds statutory provision. I realise this is mostly relevant for secondary colleagues. So this means that in 22-23 the investment from the high needs block into alternative provision will be as follows. For statutory places, the PECs and the fair access placements, the local authority would continue to pay top-up funding for 27 places at a rate of £12,825 per place, which is increased in line with inflation. And then for managed move places, which are non-statutory ones, the high needs block would continue to pay a top-up funding for 24 places, at a reduced rate of £2,825 per place, which is a reduction from the current rate, which is £6,500 per place, which equals a reduction of approximately 80k from this year's spend to 22-23 spend. It's worth noting that place funding for the provision has been maintained at the current level. The occupancy is probably a little bit lower at the moment, but we feel that that's a proportionate approach given the ongoing impact of COVID on attendance and so forth. The next part of the contract is the behaviour outreach provision. So that's the secondary provision from the Goldbourne Centre and then the primary on-site behaviour outreach. The total value of those contracts is £244,000 per year. We're not proposing any changes to those in 22-23. So the level of the high needs block investment into those services would remain as is. We have been working with Ormiston to model what the step down in local authority funding would look like, alongside talking to them about some of their wider pressures
associated with a reduction in demand provision, increasing in energy prices and some historic deficits. And they are working to develop a new charging strategy for schools for the non-statutory elements of provision. We began that discussion at secondary heads this morning, and there was an agreement to have a further conversation with secondary heads about what those charging models might be, with Ormiston leading those discussions and bringing some proposals. And we'll be looking to bring similar discussion pieces led by Ormiston to primary heads after Easter. Just to conclude, and I apologise, this is not clearly articulated at the end of the paper in terms of a clear questions forum, but effectively the paper is asking Forum to endorse the proposed level of investment into alternative provision and behaviour outreach in the academic year 22-23.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Any questions from forum members on this?
As this is non-statutory high needs block, this also be considered when we're looking at the wider picture.
Next week?
As in a reduction
Yeah.
in the investment.
Well, as in looking at it from a wider perspective in terms of the high needs block in the first place.
We can, I think.
I mean, Laura, you've read the paper off, and obviously we had a discussion with your other hat on Liberty this morning under the secondary heads. I'm really keen to support Ormiston having a conversation with your primary heads straight after Easter as well. I mean, obviously what we're proposing and seeking approval for tonight is an overall reduction on essentially commission spend on alternative provision in relation to non-statutory. Clearly we could look at increasing that reduction, but the corollary of that, of course, is a discussion with mainstream heads about what you commission directly and the continuum of that provision. And so there would be, because obviously Ormiston have certain fixed costs to provide, their offer. So I know they want to talk to you about some increases and some charges that they're considering anyway. Whether we want to bring that into next week's conversation is another matter. I mean, obviously it's with regret that we're proposing that we reduce by 80k what's spent on the provision, because we're aware of the needs of the children and the continuum, but I think because of the pressures we've spoken about, we feel we need to do that. And I know, Laura, we've been very upfront with Ormiston about the need to reduce our central spend.
So, just to clarify, will the DFE be challenging about this as well when the meeting happens tomorrow? This area too?
They will challenge us on non-statutory areas.
Yeah.
But they'll see a reduction.
Yeah, they'll see that there are plans that are, we are making changes, yeah.
Yeah, I think it could overcomplicate this meeting. It could just be.
Part of the same discussion, though, isn't it?
But it is.
It's very
part
part
of the same thing.
Yeah, it's one to cut.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's with regret we weren't able to have this conversation when we wanted to back in February, but we have to have it now because it is with regret somewhere in the system we will have to make cuts, and this is part of it.
I mean, I would absolutely, recommend that whether it's through a further meeting of the high needs review group, looking particularly at AP commissioning in the round, or through individual discussions, which we recommended that Ormiston, really happy to have, both the primary head and the secondary heads, because obviously there is an element of the early intervention services that are funded, and obviously we're seeking to reduce some of that funding, actually are preventing, I think our view is permanent exclusions and long fixed term exclusions. So, we need to consider all of that, I think, in the round with Ormiston.
So you're suggesting the sort of post-COVID behaviour impact on the service that we get from TBAT and kind of want to retain, because we're not going to take £400,000 off the alternative provision to cover what we're looking at here in the paper, because it just isn't there, is it? So, obviously we can look at taking more away from this, but what's the overall impact of that going to be on the high needs?
Isn't that the discussion that needs to be had?
Yeah, but what's the real tangible difference going to be when you look at the numbers?
If we're really going to keep children in mainstream, particularly with social emotional, and if we're really committed to that, taking the resource away from those children isn't going to help the alternative provision or the demand on alternative provision. So wherever you're going to take it away, is going to have impact.
On some,
I don't think we
yeah.
can just ignore the fact that it will have impact on mainstream.
What
Is my point.
Yeah, I think what worries me is we're being forced to rush what's actually incredibly
Yeah.
important decision making because there is an impact whatever we do, and it's which is the least impact of some horrible decisions. And it worries me that we're all rushing to make those decisions very quickly, you know, when they all need to be taken in the round.
Well, I think there are two things here. I think that there's, apologies, I think we've reached a view that we do need to do something around the education funding tool, and we'll produce a fresh set of papers and meet separately and vote on those recommendations. But more broadly, you know, the DfE absolutely want us to look at all elements of our recovery plan as well as the new, you know, the new action plan that Anita alluded to. So my suggestion would be that we do look at the high needs review group at, you know, at all areas of spending, including AP. What I would say here is, you know, Laura and Collie's done a lot of work with Ormiston to get to this stage with this paper and work through what they think are manageable reductions in what we centrally commission without excessively increasing individual charges to mainstream schools for what you commission directly, and trying to achieve that balance. And that's what the paper's recommending. At this stage, an 80k reduction.
You had a discussion this morning as secretary heads, and in that discussion, obviously 2 years ago we spoke about TBAP starting a charging arrangement, and that's a charging arrangement to all that we talked about at the time. Obviously, that's not good yet. In your discussion this morning, is it likely that the £80,000 that Ormiston need to make up is going to be falling on the shoulders of secondary schools who use the service more?
The discussion was basically you're going to have to pay us more. So we've always been charged. So we've always paid, and we've always borne the brunt of that and bought additional services from TBAP Ormiston that's really helped to prop it up. And you probably remember that we moved to 0.25% across from DSG a couple of years ago to help support TBAP stay afloat. So we, as secondary heads, as a group, we haven't agreed any figures. We said we're going to have a meeting to discuss that and work out what that's going to be. But there was a general, I mean, Mariella's here, a general commitment that we're willing to try and increase our outgoing costs to support that service, because for us in secondary, it's highly beneficial. I certainly know from the conversation Laura was there earlier today that they're really keen to have a conversation with primary schools, and more primary schools sign up to the service or to the SLA makes a huge difference.
And I just wanted to put that in a round really, because obviously there is an impact on you as secondary school heads in service being charged for, and in charging more as we go forward as well. Currently, obviously, primary schools are going through falling roles as well. That's going to come to secondary schools in the next few years, and you're agreeing to these increased costs, and they're probably manageable at the moment when your pupil numbers are going up still, and they're going to keep going up for about 2 more years. But that will come to an end, and you'll be in the same boat as primary school soon. And I just want to think long-term view about this, because at some point, these charges for services start to bite on what schools can actually do. And you'll be able to manage it now, but you might not be able to manage it in a few years' time.
Yeah, that's true. My school's numbers are going up, but Chelsea Academies, Carl Vaughan's, they're fairly static.
Well, and also because
over periods of time, because they've always been
and the majority of the secondary schools actually are, their admissions are faith-based, which changes it. I would also say that I think other colleagues and other authorities are having the exact same conversation about alternative provision and schools having to commit more, and having come from a local authority in the last 2 years, we'd already started doing that, and it was quite brutal, but we recognised we needed to.
I mean, maybe just to give one example, Jackie, so within the behaviour outreach contract, all of which is non-statutory, but I think we all recognise the value in primary and secondary through the managed intervention programme, Baldwin with primary through being able to bring up Lynn and he comes into school, and that centrally funded. If we were to propose that the 80k reduction is a larger amount, it may well be that Augustine would say, well, if you want to retain the behaviour outreach, it isn't free at the point of access, and actually they bring in a charge, may not be a huge charge, but they charge for any support from September. And I think the 80k reduction creates a balance. It's a compromise because it allows time for that discussion. Ultimately, the statutory responsibility is provision for residents who are permanently excluded. Now, our offer locally, predominantly with Ormiston, is far larger than that, and we think it prevents permanent and long fixed-term exclusions at primary and at secondary. But we recognise that the pressures are there financially, both for Ormiston and for schools. They are, it's worth saying that since Ormiston have come in, I think I went to this a few weeks ago at Latimer. I think they've delivered about £500,000 worth of savings on back office overheads across the 4 AP academies, including Hammersmith and Fulham. That's around HR, that's around finance, that's around IT. So I think there are real benefits to what Ormiston is doing, but nevertheless, the costs of the staff are the costs of the staff.
And the cost of staff increased. So
That's right.
They're funded slightly differently to maintain school. Peter?
Can I ask a question? I mean, what happens in boroughs where there is no managed move provision? The students who might wish to move school have to wait in the school that they're already in, and does this cause increased disruption?
Well, I think what we're talking about specifically here are managed moves from a mainstream school into alternative provision.
Right.
Managed moves happen between mainstream schools, and we'll continue to do what we're talking particularly about here is where we look essentially as a fresh start for a child, some specialist support at Latimer, and they're also quite high reintegration rates back into a new mainstream school and a fresh start. So that's what we're talking about here. If this weren't available and Ormiston say, well, actually the funding doesn't stack up, we can't offer it anymore, they don't have to, it's not statutory. Obviously they face real economies of scale, because actually their permanent exclusion numbers would be too small to run a separate provision, we'd have to commission that somewhere else. But schools would make other arrangements otherwise. I mean, clearly, if you look at the costs of other provision, the schools don't have to go to Ormiston. You'll know that the costs are. Thank you, Mariella. Higher, even higher.
Okay, thank you.
I think the other thing for us to contextually bear in mind is that there's DfE consultation at the moment around exclusions, suspensions, and I think that's going to make things matters a little bit more complex around these issues. We don't have this service in place. I think we're going to face problems because by looking at it today, the old school arrangements between heads to manage move is going to become very, very difficult, almost non-existent. We thought this morning looking at the paper. So this service is going to be fairly essential. Okay, so in terms of moving this forward, Ian, I don't know what you think, but I think there's been reductions made here. Understand that there's other non-statutory that I think you're right, the independent sector that we looked at, that's a big chunk of money compared to this that offers tangible value to our students.
But what flexibilities? We're making the effort to have a meeting next week.
Yeah. Yes.
So that we can look at the cuts that are being made to schools around the high needs children they've got. If we're agreeing this, we're agreeing the hospital, we're agreeing all of these things, what flexibilities are there going to be next week in terms of looking at this in greater depth or in a wider context?
Just maybe change the question slightly. We've considered 3 papers now, all of them stem or have a common theme through them about high needs. There's 21 areas in the budget report which we quite widely skipped over because we have discussed them all. But we're only looking at 2 for reductions. When do we get to talk about the others?
So can I just say we have been through every single area with the high needs review group when we did the full review before we did the an earlier version of when we did the deficit recovery plan. But I think what Ian was suggesting is that we start that review again of every line with the high needs review group. So I agree that does need to be done, but it's not the first time we would have done it.
I mean, I think obviously we've had a good discussion just now around the paper on alternative provision, and we could quite find some time to put an additional paper next week which models a higher reduction in Ormiston. Obviously, we need to talk to Ormiston, about that, but I think the corollary of that is they would then come forward sooner rather than later with charges, particularly in primary, where they're not really very good charges at the moment. So, yeah, maybe slightly counterproductive, but it doesn't mean that, as Anita said, we shouldn't have a discussion about all of the 21 areas at a high needs review group after Easter.
Can I just ask a question? It's not actually the remit of this committee, but I'm just thinking about early help and how that fits in, particularly with this area. I'm wondering if there's some kind of sensible joined up thinking that can be done around how early help fits into Ormiston, because I know that there's funding that's coming through different streams where they're looking at prevention of exclusion, and I'm thinking, hang on a minute, I'm hearing this as well. Are we making the best use of that money? So I know that's not the remit of this, but surely if we're taking a strategic approach and we recognise the importance of this work that's being done for secondary schools in particular, are there other ways around it as well? I know all of this is not going to be solved by next week, but we need to be clever, don't we?
I mean, that's a really good point, Sarah, and I think we were really pleased when the North Kensington inclusion pilot was agreed. That's actually funded out of grant for recovery, and the 50 million the council signed up to 2024, but that has given extra capacity in primary and secondary, admittedly in North Kensington, to assist with this work. I think that helps, because otherwise, I think we'd be required to spend more, given the level of need, through either high needs or through schools paying individually for Ormiston provision. I mean, there are good links with early help and Ormiston. I'm sure they could be improved further, and there's always more to do there. And I think the proposal that Laura's put forward about re-procuring over time the behaviour outreach gives us an opportunity to look at who delivers that, how it's funded, and perhaps the role of the voluntary sector as well.
Yeah, we didn't. So I didn't cover that in detail in the points that I raised. But the so the behaviour outreach contract, we've got provisions to extend that for a further 12 months, and then beyond that, we're doing some work to review the effectiveness of behaviour outreach and looking at what else exists in the market, getting some evidence from early help about their interventions, with the intention that from September 2023. We would be looking to commission like a framework model, so it wouldn't necessarily all sit with Ormiston. It might sit with Ormiston, but other agencies would be able to deliver elements of the behaviour outreach provision. So wanting to think a little bit more about what already exists and kind of shaping a future specification linked to that. Fortunately, that's like a year away from these discussions. So I think it's a really good point. I think the planned work we have in place isn't quite at the right point yet.
Okay. Right, I think in the space of a week, we're not going to be able to re-review, evaluate these TBAP arrangements, go back to Ormiston Academies Trust, renegotiate, and then have on the table what this is actually going to cost every individual school. Because it's just going to cost the schools more, and it could end up costing a lot more individually than the reductions that we're looking at in the paper. So I think it just could be a bridge too far at this point. I think what I propose is that we go with the recommendations, okay, limit all the real concerns. This goes back into the high needs review group specifically as something that's looked at all the other 21 areas, and there's an in-depth look at that straight after Easter.
And also that, as I say, Laura and myself with Ormiston will absolutely come to primary head straight after Easter to have that broader discussion about what's commissioned centrally and what schools might want to pay for and be willing to pay for centrally non-statutory.
Yeah, this also demonstrates reduction as well, which is something we set with DFE tomorrow.
20k, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so should we vote on this? Okay, so the proposal is that we go with the recommendation of the £80,000 reduction as is, that we take it into the high needs review going forward to really look at it, recognising that we made that reduction and that this is something that we're really not going to resolve with Ormiston anytime soon.
I'm not quite sure what that means. So several things there, aren't there? So what we're being asked to vote on is that reduction.
Is the 80k reduction for the reasons that if we go back, we're going to be no example.
Okay, and I think that's it, isn't it? That's what we asked to vote on. I think the other things are really need to inform the sort of information, and this isn't criticism, believe me, difficult to get to grips with, but is realisation that when we're being asked to make decisions in relation to recommendations of this form, we need a balance of information across other things. So, for instance, as an example, the high needs and this particular piece of work, you know, which is the least worst option. You know, and as an impact assessment, a risk assessment about these things. What actually, if you invest in it, recruits money. I know it's complicated and it's like shifting sands. You might make a decision and then 6 months later the whole sort of climate has changed in relation to funding. It's like we kind of do the work here.
I think it's also slightly unfair if I can add that there's a meeting tomorrow that's been set up and we're pressured by that, on top of which we're trying to get this through by the 31st of March. It's the 23rd of March. You know, the meeting's been booked for some time. We had the papers in a short period before. There are a lot of serious issues here, and clearly a lot of people have wanted to be involved and haven't been. And yet, there's a D&E meeting tomorrow that's sort of bearing down on us, and we're not sure where discussions, you know, good discussions with external bodies get worse. Well, actually, they might get better. We don't know, but we're being pushed into a very tight decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think look, this isn't the first time we've discussed any of these things, though, really.
No, but specifics. It is.
It's not a forum. It absolutely is in terms of looking at reducing deficits.
But the details of it are different.
Sorry, can I just say,
Not
I mean,
modelled figures.
the focus of this group is about custodianship, whatever it is, as the finances. But actually, any sort of group I'm ever involved in, you look at it in relation to what's the least worst option, what's the impact going to be, and the impact on the end user. And I think, from my point of view, I think you guys will absolutely have to speak with that. You know it. I don't. Because actually, I think I might know it. I think I might know that Kathleen, and by the way, how come we've been using a tool which doesn't differentiate between, 3-year-olds not being able to do their parts up and 10-year-olds? I didn't know that either. But then there's lots of things that we just need very clearly set out so that we can join in, not we, I can join in the scrutiny in relation to balancing and voting on the least worst option. In the sure and certain knowledge that we've got to actually reduce this deficit. Otherwise, it will end with massively tears.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I mean, look, nobody wants to make these decisions, do they? This is the point of the forum. We've got to make difficult decisions. And
I don't want to make the decisions. I just want to make sure that I'm making the best.
I mean, I suppose, we can have meeting after meeting. The purpose of this meeting was to put up these papers about these issues to make these decisions. And, we're now at this meeting having another meeting. Now, the papers are being supplied in the way that they've always been supplied, and we've got to make the decisions in that time limit.
I mean, I absolutely take the points to some extent, but particularly about the high needs review group. The smooth running of forum, I think it is supported by regular working groups. Obviously, it's a balance of all of you willing to give them time or seek representative colleagues who might well be governor, fellow governors or heads. And I think we absolutely hear that point that we need to reconstitute and republicise the high needs review group in particular. Ultimately, of course, the DSG is a local authority grant. It's a large local authority grant. Myself, Anita, Sarah Newman, we're all in those meetings with corporate finance colleagues and with members. Particularly looking at the deficit. So, we do have those responsibilities too. We ultimately have to take those decisions, but we want to do it through, as you're saying, this proper discussion at forum and ideally by agreement with forum. These aren't easy decisions. So I appreciate that.
I think we actually have been discussing this for a long time. We've talked about TBAC before, and in other fora we've also talked about making putting charges for TBAC services too, and we have discussed it in discussion groups as heads as well. But it was pre-pandemic, and some time ago, and I can see why some people wouldn't remember that clearly. We've been through a tough time. looking at these figures, the direction of travel is the right direction because they have to, it is a non-statutory service and we've got to reduce that. And I think that obviously we're only making a decision on 1 year's figures right now. So I personally think we should be making that decision. I accept that the decision might need to go further because it is a non-statutory figure. And I think as we go further into that, and I can see you've negotiated well, but the idea that funding then starts to rise in 24, 25, when probably things are going to be even tougher by then, I can see why you've probably negotiated that, and I can see why you have to agree it. But I imagine by the time we get there, these figures will be different, and we'll probably be spending less on this by then. But that's not tonight's decision.
Yeah.
Tonight's
Why
decision
this needs
is
to go
that
back to the High Review Group for the long
absolutely.
period.
So the decision, we have to make this decision as far as I'm concerned. I think we probably need to aim for more of a reduction going forward, unfortunately.
Okay, so nobody wants to vote for this, do they? I don't, but we've got to make cuts somewhere. And we've there are pressures that none of us want, but lots and lots of work has gone into offices to try and negotiate and to reduce and to make these things work. So
could you actually put it to the vote now? And if people, if there are a sufficient number of abstentions, it signals the fact that people are not willing to vote now. But if they are willing to vote now, we vote. Otherwise, we're going to be here forever.
Yeah.
Just for 1 year. Just for 1 year.
That's right. For the contract value for the next year, that's right.
And just to clarify, I was very clear about how I was going to vote on this area, but actually what I heard was that it was going to be considered in relation to the meeting that we're going to convene in short order.
I
if that's not the case, then that's fine.
I sat in the high needs block really 3 or 4 years ago now. There was a commitment to significantly reduce the amount of money we're spending on independent private placements. I know it has reduced to an extent, but we're still spending a large amount. That commitment was made, and it's never been delivered. And my concern is that are we just going to go on and on making decisions, making commitments, but nothing changes? Because we still have that huge commitment to private placements, and we said 4 years ago that was going to change significantly.
I think I would say something. I think it has been changing, but at the same time, demand and EHC, these assessment requests have just been going up and up and up, and they've really gone up sharply in the past 2 years. And also complexity of needs has increased, and that's been our challenge, because as Julie said earlier, we haven't always been able to agree local placements and work with parents on the local premises. We're getting a lot more of that we used to, and we've got fantastic inclusive schools with capacity, children going into mainstream, we've got new resource bases, new special schools, but actually we can't always meet needs locally, and demand is just going up and up. I mean, part of our broader discussion is exactly around what we're doing in AP and other areas of early intervention to try and make sure the ordinarily available support, SEN support, is there, so that we aren't getting all of the EHC assessment requests, for perfectly understandable, reasons from your Senkos and from parents. But it's that balance, isn't it? We know that actually parental confidence has gone down actually during lockdown if their child's SEN support, which is why the EHC assessment requests have gone up.
Yeah, which is why High Needs Review Group need to look at this, and they actually formally need to report back into this form.
But the overspend for private provision is 1.3 million, and that's a big chunk of everything we're spending. Yeah. So I know it's not this forum, but obviously there's a new school providing some of that provision, and yet it's still going up. So we need more provision, and this is that's for the local authority, not for us, perhaps, to try and reduce that figure, because as I said earlier, it's a third of our total spend. It is a massive chunk.
I mean, again, Andrew wants to move on. What I would say is we absolutely acknowledge we've got higher levels of spend, definitely compared to Westminster, in the 16 to 25 and the 18 to 25 age range. And that will include, private provision. Those are conversations that we're having with social care, and, as you know, if a family goes to tribunal and that their child might be a young adult, might be 24, if we try and cease the plan, they'll go to tribunal and they would. Okay, so they've got a plan for 25, but we recognise that's a challenge. It's probably against something for us to talk about at the review group. And it's worth saying is we have made some headway with adult social care where we think that actually some of that provision is education, it's adult daycare.
Yeah, that's. And I'm going to say one more thing. I don't think the children in mainstream should be the collateral damage. The children who get the least support, the most vulnerable, whose parents can't advocate, can't afford lawyers, can't push for private placements, I don't think they should be the collateral damage in this reduction.
This is why I'm looking forward to the SEND group paper coming out. So I don't think they foresaw the impact of, practically every tribunal judgment going in parents' favour. And of course, we were spending on 10% between 16 and 18 and pre-16, and now the spend goes all the way up to 25. Can't get away from that challenge.
Okay. Thanks.
Sorry.
I totally agree with that. But we've got to try and resolve this. So, proposal to go with the £80,000 reduction, and obviously then we look in detail at the issues that have been raised in the high needs group in a lot more detail, and that to be reported back to the board. So, okay, let's vote on yeses to agree to the £80,000 reduction. Okay, thanks everybody. We move on to A8. This is falling roles, proposed allocations, and this is Poonam, who is going to lead on this. Just want to note that there was an error in some of the papers that went out reference to allocations to Jones Primary School, which have been since corrected in the online version. Paper copies may have the error, so please disregard the inclusion of Thomas Jones.
Yeah, our apologies. Our apologies. Thank you. Thank you. So, this paper runs through the proposed allocations of the 22-23 Falling Roles Fund. In January, Forum agreed Falling Roles funding of £341,000 for the school block. As well as agreeing with the criteria to qualify for this funding. Most of that criteria remained unchanged and is specified in section 1.4 of the report. One new criteria that was agreed at January Forum was that schools with estimated balances at the end of this financial year, so 21-22, that are above the levels considered excessive by the ESSA, and that's 8% for primaries and 5% for secondaries, should not qualify for funding, and that funding will be clawed back should the school's balance at the end of this financial year be considered excessive by those standards. Appendix A showed the 9 schools that met the criteria for falling roles funding, and 7 of these schools submitted their business case to support the use of these funds in 22-23, totaling £338,000. Officers review the business cases and examine the balances to ascertain whether the school needs any additional funding and what actions they are taking to restructure and deal with the reducing numbers of pupils. The main action evident across these business cases was planned restructures, but in addition to that, there was also some years extension, reviewing forms of entry, increasing offers and marketing. All of the business cases provided an updated financial position, and any funding agreed will be subject to schools' balance at the end of this year, and as long as they're not considered excessive by the ESFA. Just to note though, based on the latest forecast that we've received, 4/7 of these schools that put bids in are not expecting to have balances that are above this threshold. Appendix A will have the detail of the bids received and how much
falling rolls up now.
The think tanks out there are beginning slowly to challenge the previous conception in regard to falling rolls. Are there any big projects on the horizon to build that will generate families moving back into the area they found moving down? Is there anything new in the pipeline, anything that's coming our way, the direction of travel looking a little bit more favourable over the next, say, 10 years? Or is there nothing at all? Is it still between the
It would be the borough plan, wouldn't it? It would be that would be designated for building residential.
I have looked at this with my geography degree, and there are a number of developments in the north of the housing developments in the north of the borough.
Around the canal?
Yeah, around the canal. I mean, sorry, I'm not prepared to comment, or at least I haven't prepared a comment on this, but there's one large development close to the railway line, and a variety of others close to the canal. My own view is that they will at least halt the decline. But one of the things you don't know from the public available information is, the mix of units being developed, the number of children per unit, and all of that sort of data that enables you to just sort of, as a former analyst, sort of project forward. But there are things going on now. Whether it will be big enough to mask, Brexit, move out of town, other things that might come along. Frankly, who knows?
And yeah, I would agree, Peter. I think that we're always we try to be conservative with the small c in terms of what we might describe as the yield from new housing developments, given the mix and so on. And that, I think, definitely our experience in Westminster, and to a lesser extent in KT, is that sometimes those projections have been over optimistic in terms of numbers of children, likely to attend state schools on the back of new developments. But we absolutely keep an eye on that, and that's why we amend the projections every year. Obviously, they come into Schools Forum, and as you know, Forum commissioned a significant piece of work through the ISIS partnership, and we discussed those recommendations, progress towards them in detail. We're currently on about 15% spare capacity in primary based on the autumn census, primarily in the north. We had a good discussion, I think, in the Education Partnership Board fairly recently about that, and whilst it's absolutely something we need to keep under review, I should say, if schools come forward with proposals around change their published admission number and so on, then absolutely that's a discussion that we can have. But in terms of amending the recommendation, I think the view both of Forum and the Education Partnership Board was that we don't need to change that recommendation, which was to remove 1 to 2 forms of entry. And I think, as colleagues know, one of the schools, right up in the north, St Mary's, is reducing its published admission number by 1 form of entry. So, but yeah, the birth rate continues to fall. The impact of other factors such as Brexit and COVID continue to be negative rather than positive, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions on rolls?
One point I have to say, we continue to spend more money on formal roles, and I'm not saying that's the right or the wrong thing, but I do have to flag that this is it's a larger number of schools this time. It is a large amount of money, and whilst we've discussed and agreed the criteria and the allocations this year, I would recommend that we come back early in the new financial year and look at the criteria for falling roles. And just to give you one example, again, because of the rising spend in our other borough, one of the criteria we agreed through a working group discussion was to say that if schools had falling roles funding in 1 year, they wouldn't then get it in the following year. It wouldn't be recurrence if that 5% drop were repeated. Now, again, that's not a welcome proposal, but what I'd recommend is we do come back and have that discussion in a timely way in the new financial year about next year's falling roles criteria.
Just to check from that point, so is this actually double the amount that's in the budget? Because it's 155 this year, 340.
Yeah, so when the budgets were set, if I understood you correctly, Stephen, and apologies if I haven't, so when we set the budgets for 22-23, it was agreed that 341 would be held centrally from schools' budgets in total to fund for the
So now we're looking at 21-23. So
But it has increased since then.
So it's
Yes.
doubled since this.
Yeah, as Ian said, there's more schools. Yeah.
So its recommendation is to agree the figure, 240, which is supportive of some of our schools that are really, really struggling, but obviously, as always, to come back and review going forward and continue, in particular, look at what numbers on roll are around October, census time, and see what the drop-offs are. Some schools, this, it's really going to have a significant impact on helping balance their budget this year. Sarah, there's £216. Is that yours?
Yeah, I decided not to do it for that.
Honestly, don't spend that all at once.
So Andrew, can I start? Sorry. So going back to my point about, is there any positive news in regard to projects that might generate more numbers going forward? And in the end, you answered it very succinctly. The answer is no. And if the direction of travel is that gradually the amount of allocated funding for schools with falling roles will reduce, it may well get to the stage where it goes to a vote in this form perhaps, or that there is direction of travel from the partnership board that recommends that the funding eventually whittles to nothing. The onus then would be surely on schools to independently make their decisions what to do, to amalgamate, to close. But surely the borough has responsibility to lead that, not independent schools, not the schools themselves.
Well, I think that there were two things there, David. So, in terms of a school setting their own 3-year budget, or, so seeking to agree, a deficit recovery plan, which obviously, comes through to us, that's a piece of work that obviously sits with the governors. In terms of, more broadly where we are in the work of the ISOS partnership, we could always commission more work. We could, so to give an example, we've agreed at Forum in Westminster to amend and increase the recommendations to reduce spare capacity because the numbers are dropping quite starkly. That's not what I think we're recommending at this stage, but of course Forum would say, let's have another look at that. The reason I'm making the point about the falling roles criteria and whether they should be amended in future years is because the money for the falling roles comes from all of you. It comes from the schools, it's de-delegated. So if that amount goes up, obviously some schools are getting money back, but all of you are seeing de-delegation increase at a time when your budgets are really tight. And that's why I'm recommending, because obviously our role is like the DSG year. So
I'm probably the only person here who thinks this, but hopefully I'm not. Surely then, a group like ISOS or another group, what they could do would be to model an absolute worst case scenario. Really good at that. And then what one does is put something into place, interpolate something that is a better case scenario with adaptations. Rather than what I can see might happen, which is it just becomes more and more painful. Governing bodies become more, they feel quite alone, I suppose, and they're forced into making decisions that they've made before. And strategy just doesn't exist. There isn't a sort of gradual, strategic approach to it, which, is what the Borough prides itself on, strategy. So I would certainly recommend that at some point soon, when we do engage with an organisation like us, to look at ensuring that worst case scenario either doesn't happen, or if it does happen, it's reduced somewhat.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I have to sort of declare an interest here because, of course, Oxford Gardens is one of the schools with a significant. Actually, in relation to the decisions that we're making here, it's not about the money comes from review. That's not what we're about. Surely, what we're about is looking at some point. It's where I agree with you, David, that the strategy thus far how effective, what's the evidence that actually this investment that we've agreed to go into schools and falling roles? And as I say, mine is one of them, so I'm trying to keep my sort of separate. We're looking at evidence here, we're not looking at sort of anecdotal stuff. I'm not accusing anybody of doing that, but don't be wrong. But what the next step would be, rather than being driven by the fact that, oh, this is a huge amount of money and it's coming out of your pockets, metaphorically speaking, it's about looking at the impact that it's had thus far, and then reassessing and then changing the criteria on the basis of that. I do accept that this forum is about managing the finances and resources, but again, I have to say, we only do that on the basis of reinvesting. We need to look at what we've got for that investment and then reappraise. And then perhaps we will make a decision there will be no fraud because we tried it, we've invested, and it hasn't worked. And I don't think we're ever going to get a clear idea because look, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 10 years ago, trying to think about what population changes would be. It's a big limit. So it has to be evidence driven. And again, I think we'll come back and review the criteria, but not on a can we afford to do this again? Because we afforded it thus far.
I think
we just have to continue and review this and see what the current state of the school organisation is. So some of what you just said is probably the work of the Education Partnership Board and the strategic direction that they will provide going forward, and look at the financial aspect. But this forum has always, certainly the number of years I've been on it, and lots of people have been on longer, highly supportive of schools that struggle. And that has been a really good thing, and I certainly interest.
So can the partnership board maybe comment on that then? Because in the past we've had very short-term dips where, of course, financial support for schools have been for 1 year. There has been a small reduction, couldn't really determine where it was. This seems to be very sustained. It's been quite a long time we've been talking about it. The ISA support's 2 years old now, more. So what's the partnership thinking the strategy should be? Because I'm quite interested in your suggestion.
Well, I think the view, Andrew, you kind of gave your time to join the last partnership board where we discussed progress against the ISOS recommendation. I'm not suggesting we reopen that discussion this evening, and I think there was a view at the partnership board that good progress has been made against the recommendations. I think we have 3 schools in deficit, so that's gone down to 2. Financial information is coming through to the team, and hopefully you all feel support and advice is coming through in a more fluid and timely way. And the 1 to 2 forms of entry reduction already, 1 form's been achieved. Other conversations are happening with schools, so it may get to 2. I think Quiffy's point, absolutely agree. We're not suggesting tonight that the falling roles criteria are changed. Work has gone into this paper. This is being recommended to you all, but I'm flagging, which I've done in previous years, that we need to look at the criteria annually. They are agreed locally, and we can change them, and we might need to, mindful of the impact on the DSG and the schools block.
So in the past we've had bulge classes in primary schools where we've seen very large increases very rapidly and can build a new school for them. And at the last couple of meetings I've got the feeling that we've been talking about the fact that we will have reductions for at least another 2 years, if not more. Not to remind me because I could be wrong. And if that's the case, was there a plan at partnership for doing something about that? Because we could always reopen them when numbers start increasing, but we can't just keep funding them. There is no risk that there's a structural deficits in lots of schools hidden by this extra money that's going into them.
Well, the aim of the falling roles funding, which is only available to good and outstanding schools, is to support with the one-off costs of essentially adjusting staffing. With fewer children, the theory is you need fewer staffing, fewer staff, and therefore this money enables the costs of that reorganisation as a one-off, rather than, as you say, Stephen, propping up the status quo year on year, which is why I'm saying we need to look at potentially changing the criteria so that it's one-off funding rather than recurrent.
I think we're going to stop that. We're now having the discussion that we're going to have further down the line, what we just talked about. So we need to agree this. At the last meeting, we agreed a formula for this falling roles. That's what we agreed. here is now the result of what we agreed. So we just have to agree what we agreed to do, really. Jack, you
Can I just quickly ask something? I mean, Anita, when you were talking, sorry, when you were talking about the point a minute ago, you basically said that the three schools that had excessive balances that applied for funding no longer have excessive balances anymore.
On the latest forecast we've received, they should.
So they no longer have excessive balances, and some of these excessive balances were large. Yeah. So actually, we're patting ourselves on the back saying that there's only two schools in deficit at the moment, but on this trajectory, 5 schools won't be in deficit by this time next year. Right? That's the reality of these figures. And so I think you're right, we do have an issue. There is a structural deficit that's growing within the schools, and it's happening very quickly. ISOS was brilliant, but it gave us something to work for a couple of years, and we've got that. The situation is moving fast, and it's starting to move as fast as Westminster. We normally import children from Hampstead and Fulham and Westminster and Brent and Wandsworth, which is great. That's drying up. We're probably importing fewer children than ISOS predicted or thought, yeah, because they aren't there. The reality is that things are moving quite quickly, and we do need to probably, and it's good to hear that you want to do something perhaps with ISOS or some other organisation, and it is a statutory duty, the local authority to place a plan, so it's time. We need to do it again, and we need to think about how we're going to do it.
We can definitely bring we're definitely a further update back, as you know, and all I can say to you is that there are discussions underway with a number of schools about further progress towards that, you know, 2FE reduction target. It may be, and that's not a ceiling, that's not a cap target. So if more schools come forward and say, actually, we want to make these changes, we think it's best for our school, it gives us more viable budget, you know, probably by the summer meeting, we may be, definitely by the autumn, we could report back to you on more changes and more progress. And maybe at that time, Forum wants to decide if they do want to recommission ISOS, or whether actually there is sufficient local progress and we're able to manage this together.
Yeah, but I think we need to come back to with crystal ball gazing into next year's budgets, given the 7 yet. So we know where it's likely going to land up. Let's let them be submitted and then look at them at the appropriate time. So I'll finalise this. So I asked please to submit the report, and school forum are recommending to allocate polling rolls funds to meet the criteria in Appendix A of £338,000. Agreed. Yep. Okay, A9 supplementary grant update. Poonam.
Thank you. This table provides some further detail around the school supplementary grant on the back of the summary position of the last board. The indicative allocation for Kensington and Chelsea is 2.3 million, and final allocations will be in spring 22 based on pupil data. This funding is expected to be incorporated into core school budget allocations from 23-24.
Sorry.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Yeah, I was just thinking, you know what I mean. So I think it will be treated as though it's part of your delegated budget. So I think when the minimum funding guarantee is worked out for 23-24, I think that will be included, and this funding will be added into the schools block as a DSG.
So does that mean there'll be more DSG to distribute?
Yes. Yes. I think the timing of it, they didn't have time to add it into DSG.
Thank you. And section 2 of the report runs through the base funding rates of the S16 for all early years, moving through to Pro 16. These rates are subject to the area cost adjustment. Section 3 has some additional information about how the allocations will be calculated. And in Appendix A, we have estimated the proposed allocations for each RBKT school. Just to note, these are estimates, and the final figures will actually be calculated by DFE. Across the top of the appendix, you will find the area adjusted rates just for reference. The DFE have also published a calculator to give schools a close estimation of the funding that they can expect to receive, and that's linked at the bottom. Rush that a bit.
Right, thank you. Any questions on this?
Slightly different one. In your discussions with DFE, have you had any indication at all about any possible help to deal with utility costs? Because certainly in our school, the cost of increased utilities far outweighs all the other things we've been talking about tonight.
Yeah.
So there's a budget.
So,
We haven't talked about that at all.
so I've raised that with the DFE, and their response was, that's covered by this supplementary grant. That's the response from the DFE.
Can you give us some?
I mean, this is actually the only bit of good news really coming in tonight, isn't it? Getting this supplementary grant. This is a real bonus, but it's like
In my pot without the other. So, yeah, thank you very kindly for us. Yeah.
Okay, right, thanks very much for that. We'll move on to paper A10. This is the, oh sorry, I should have just said, I just asked the committee to note the report and the allocations and basic appendix A. Move on to A10, this is feedback on scheme change, consultation recommendations. We discussed aspects of this in the last meeting. This is the proposal for 23-24. I think there was some discussion about this in the last meeting. I know that officers have gone back and looked at this and tried to find a middle ground to supporting schools. I think particularly some of the primary schools with the concerns that we raised. So hopefully we'll get to that.
Thank you. Yeah, so the proposal of the consultation that we did for the last time was basically to bring forward the deadline for the submission of this 3-year budget in the last working day of May to the first working day of May from 23-24. The response rate for the consultation was quite low, with only 5 schools responding. All 5 though did object to the proposed change. The main reasons for this were workload pressures for SBMs, concern over the amount of time this will take to get full board governance approval of the budget, and also the respondents felt that the submission of financial information throughout the year should be sufficient. So we took all of that on board, and we do understand the issues that have been raised, and so to support the schools in meeting this proposed earlier deadline, the local authority will provide draft budgets following the approval at January forum, with the caveat that it is subject to approval of the APT by the ESFA. So currently the budgets are sent out after the APT is approved, and this proposal to send out the draft budget straight after January forum should mean, depending on schools forum meeting dates, that it's about a month extra with your draft budget. Additionally, where schools are unable to gain government approval within the revised time frame, the local authority is willing to accept a draft version of the 3-year plan by the proposed deadline, and then if there's any changes following the government meetings, the final budgets by the original deadline. The appendices attached to the paper are the current scheme and the proposed scheme with the track changes in section 2.3.
Okay, so they're the proposals to try and meet in the middle and support. What are the views for Peter?
Just to record that Avondale St Anne's Federation are against the borough proposal as well. I think most, if not all, of the primary schools still remain against the proposals for the reasons stated in paragraph 3.3, and as you've heard tonight, schools are struggling with budgets due to budget cuts and other changes. And I would be grateful if you could hold a vote on the proposal, please.
I want to vote on the proposal.
Yes.
Okay, so Schools Forum is asked to approve the. Are there any other comments actually? Sorry.
I suppose the only thing to add is that we discussed this at consultative.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a single voice support. And then it went to I think it was briefing when we came on. I said it would be a good idea for police to that, and she spoke. And, forgive me if I worded it incorrectly, to promote what was suggested. It wasn't, it wasn't a terribly partisan meeting, was it? It wasn't much in response. But I think in some ways, that's because we just sort of thought that this isn't going to work for us. reasons. And wasn't just the heads of single because there were two primary school heads as well who also expressed this. So I think Peter kind of worded it quite well there. It does feel that the general consensus amongst primary heads anyway is that there's concern.
Okay. So I think so.
Sorry, can I just?
Yes.
So I guess I'm quite disappointed because I feel that we've tried to, I understand where heads are coming from, but I feel we've tried to address the points that have been made. We're not giving a shorter timescale, and we're not asking for you to change your governing body meetings if that's not feasible. And I don't know, I'm struggling a bit as to why it's still, schools just don't agree, but I'll just,
Is what you're saying, my understanding is that you're setting you're giving the budget figures a lot earlier, 4 weeks. You're then asking for a draft to be submitted by an earlier date, final to be then submitted on the original date. And the reason to get the draft is to allow more time for officers to look at the numbers.
And which schools are, going to have thinking they're going to have a deficit. Where do we need to get extra support into schools? Do we need to look at any resources? How we manage our support to schools? Those sorts of things, really.
But wouldn't you know that already from all the information that's being sent to school, sent to the borough? Because each month we're submitting a lot more information than we would have been 2 years ago. And also, it's the actual setting of the budget, even if it's a draft, takes quite a lot of time and effort, especially when things are really, really tight.
I also think you might need governor's approval just to put a draft in, so you're back to 2 governor's meetings.
So it's
the draft
doing it
budget
twice
and
is
then
the one,
final.
yeah.
But we're giving the same amount of time as there is now. And obviously this is the first time we see the school's plans against the new year budget. Yes, we've got lots of information. For the majority of schools, we get the information quarterly. For those in deficit, it's monthly. We can't, it's hard to assess what the impact is on a new year budget. So it really is key information that we do look at and work out what we need to do in response to that.
If you cut down your staff in a one-form elementary school and they only work term time, and that time is just not there. If you've got 1 or 2 sessions where you sit with your bursar to do that, it will increase cost. So we're trying on one hand to look at reductions. So you look at that, and then to do this with already we're now looking monthly at the earnings. So we have to do monthly submissions to get our numbers for that. So it's just like incremental increases. We're getting to a point where it's just too much for the level of admin that we have.
However, sorry, Deb, can I just give a slight thought on this? Lots of schools would be able to meet that deadline. Yeah. Some schools wouldn't be able to, but lots of schools would. So if some schools are able to meet the deadline, then would we not want to support the local authority in them being able to look at that data early, to look at those numbers for those schools? And where schools can't meet it, that there's an extension clause.
But you don't want to be in a position where you're kind of constantly asking for an extension. If the policy is that it's the 1st of May, then in my experience, it's the 1st of May. And we're a year later, down the line, 2 years later, it's the 1st of May, you're not meeting it, there's a black mark against your audit report. So I think it has to be clear cut, and I think that, you've got to weigh up.
Because it's only a draft at that point, remember?
Yeah, but you still got to put the effort into doing the draft and making it balance. I think you'll just get a paper exercise. If that's the case, yes, we all can meet that, but you'll be getting a paper exercise that's not really been scrutinised properly. And I just think I don't see the value in putting more and more pressure onto schools.
So I'll go to Amanda and then.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just had a couple of points on tonight, they're not questions as such. The local authority appears to me to be asking for this to make their lives easier, because presumably you've got cuts of staff, and And so, no, so you
It's
want
about us being able,
advance
it's about us
information.
trying to be more responsive and being able to, we have had some cuts to our stuff, it's not about that, it's about us working out where do we need to, where do we need to target our resources in terms of supporting the schools.
Okay, the
Because of this
issue-
changing
No,
landscape.
Yeah, I understand that. The issue with primary schools, let's face it, until a month before, until the day you submit your budgets, there are movable fees. The numbers we're talking about, some of them are so small and you're juggling between whatever. So actually, if they submit it a month earlier, it's meaningless anyway, because it will change the impact of certain things going on in that final month. It's really quite swinging in their budget, so.
I presume this will be the same sort of issue for secondary.
No.
I don't think it would be.
It's going to be different.
No.
There's going to also certainly be
have to submit it a month before year starts.
So that's the same with Chelsea then, so it's actually only All Saints that's in the same boat.
Yeah.
Only a small. All right.
I mean, I'd be happy to, in terms of where schools are in, specific circumstances. We had, the deadline is extended in these circumstances, and there are some very good exceptional circumstances in some of the schools that we're aware of, long-term sick and things like that. So, which then wouldn't count as a black mark.
But that's odd. Did you submit by the 1st of March? We did on the 1st of May.
A draft budget.
And no one can influence that.
A draft budget is a draft.
But it will be a meaningless piece of paper. That's what
I think it actually could be a dangerous piece of paper, because if modelling is then done on a particular budget and school improvement, for example, or whoever it is gets involved and it's not the right figures, then how's that helpful?
Yeah, that's a good point. What's the current date for the final deadline?
31st of May.
So it's a month later.
I don't think you can persuade anybody.
I'm trying to find some sort of common ground here.
Just think about the practicalities of the decisions we've been making tonight. Yeah. There are several decisions that we're making that are actually on the eve of the end of the financial year. Yeah. Right. That all schools don't know about what those decisions are going to be yet. We are in the throes of starting to close budgets right now, and reopening set budgets. We don't really have the figures with which to set budgets right now. Admittedly, we've got quite a lot more than we normally have because DfE's been a bit quicker this year than they have been for the last 7 years. But we can't guarantee they're going to always get on with it. They have a track record of not doing that. So the reality is that this date deadline could be quite difficult for more schools than we think. If we were in a normal year where they get the budgets to us in mid-February, we don't get actual indicative figures until later in spring term, and it becomes quite difficult. So I can understand why you want to make it sooner. A whole month could be difficult for everybody, and I do wonder if there's some kind of middle ground really in that month of May that could be more manageable and possible for everybody.
Steve.
So I've got just a bit of advice on watching. Do you need this information for your return to the DfE, or is it just in terms of other kids?
Yeah, it's not for the DfE, it's just in town.
Because the DfE is pushing academies more and more to get the information in earlier and earlier. So I just wanted to tell whether it was something that was pressing.
I mean, we can go to a vote back and see where the vote's going. To be honest, because there's a significant number of primary school voices here who are very clear in what they're saying, that they're in complete disagreement.
Well, speaking for the secondary sector, I'd support them. I think that everything that we've been trying to work on over the last year is to support these struggling schools. And if they're saying loudly and clearly they can't cope, then we should hear them. We should move on.
Yeah, I think that's the consensus. I think we have to keep 23-24 the same date that was in the original scheme for last year. Agreed?
Agreed, thank you, Chair.
I think the only thing we can do is really encourage schools to have a dialogue with the finance team and build trust, I think, that way.
Yeah,
I think it's not to say that we won't discuss it.
Yeah, and absolutely, and in the collegiality of working together, working for local authority, trying to get finalise budgets in as early as we can.
Yeah, I'm going to say,
So
can
we're
we
not
change
leaving
some
you
wording that
hands
says that, you know, the recommended date will be
Yes.
whatever, but the final date is X? So that, you know.
Yeah.
Beautifully.
I think that's the
I like
helpful point
that.
that you,
Lawyers' wording, you see.
I think that's the helpful point that you made, Sarah. Maybe we can look at that wording, Anita, that, you know, there's something about best efforts too. Submit by acknowledging.
Oh no, I was just going to say that hopefully this new budgeting tool that's coming in, hopefully will enable you to be able to see what people's budgets are in advance anyway, so I understand it.
We only see it once
When
it's
it's
been
published,
submitted.
yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
yes, that might help, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's no question, is there, that schools who don't submit to the latest date, there will be nothing that flags up to auditors that
No.
they're not doing the right
No,
job?
because it'd be in line with the scheme,
Fine.
so, yeah.
Okay, so in terms of what we were agreeing here, we're agreeing the scheme for financing schools, but amending the date of submission
Well,
for
we're
final
keeping
budgets
as it was.
Yeah.
to vote. Yeah, but what has been put in front of you is
Being
has a different date. So we're saying that the date for final submission is the 31st of May for school budgets.
Right.
We're rejecting the recommendation.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, fantastic. A11, any other business?
I've got one. I've got one well shared. That's it.
Organised.
All right, that concludes school forum. Thanks everybody. Take care. Yeah, so you.
Trying to get civic meeting.